So last week we ended chapter 3 of the book of Esther, and if you remember, chapter 3 had Haman create the document to send out to everyone that on the 13th day of the 12th month, that the people were supposed to kill as many Jews as they can find. And they were supposed to plunder their houses, take their possessions, and basically wipe out the Jewish people completely. The king didn't really know what was going on. Him and Haman went out to drink at the end. They went to their dinner, all nice and happy, but the entire city was confused. Shushan, the citadel, the capital of the empire, was just completely confused. They didn't know what was going on. And so in chapter 4, we continue the story. It says in verse 1, it says, "When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. He went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every command and decree around, great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes." So Mordecai got the information, and he goes out. He changes his clothes into mourning clothes, sackcloth and ashes. It's actually an Oriental tradition of mourning that somehow the Jewish people picked up, of the sackcloth and ashes. They wear the sackcloth and they sit in ashes, and it was that kind of a mourning. They were upset. And he went and he started wailing, crying and wailing throughout the city in a loud and bitter cry. And I'm trying to imagine if someone did this today. You know, they're crying, they're in the middle of the city. And he does this throughout the city, crying and wailing. And of all the Jews, he probably has the most reason, because he's the one that caused all of this. And he probably realized it. And he was just crying and wailing, and he went as far as the gate to the king's palace, because no one is allowed into the king's gate while they're in mourning. And it was probably a superstitious thing with the Persian Empire, with their many gods that they believed in, that people in mourning, they have bad spirits with them. And if they go in to see the king, those bad spirits could connect to the king, cause him problems, cause him to go into mourning, cause problem for the whole nation. No one's allowed to go in near the king whenever they're in mourning. And so he's in sackcloth and ashes. He's crying and wailing. He goes as far as the king's gate. He knows the rule. He ain't going in that gate. And so he sits there and he cries out, and he's wailing and he's weeping. And this happens not only with Mordecai, but in every city and every province where there's Jewish people and they read this, they all start crying. They all start weeping, mourning, fasting, wearing sackcloth and ashes. And it mentions fasting with them. And so we have all this going on throughout the kingdom, and the king really doesn't know what's going on. He's kind of separated from everything. And so in chapter 4, it says, "So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him. But he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai in the city square, concerning Mordecai, to learn what had happened, why and what this was." So I'm going to pause there for a moment. Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her that Mordecai was mourning at the gate. Now, up until this point, they don't know the relationship between Mordecai and Esther. She has kept it secret for 5 years. No one knows that she's a Jew. But they know that there's some kind of relationship between Mordecai and Esther, because he sent messages to Esther about the two doorkeepers. And so they know that there's something there, but they don't know what it is. And so they go and they tell him, hey, Mordecai is like making a ruckus over there at the king's gate. He's weeping, he's wailing, he's wearing sackcloth and ashes. And so just thought you should know. Esther is upset. She's like, what's going on? What is so tragic that Mordecai would be wailing and weeping this much, and he's wearing sackcloth and ashes out in the city? What's happening? And so she wants to talk to him. So she sends him other clothes to put on. She says, take off your sackcloth and ashes, put these on so I can talk to you, is what's implied here, is that she wanted him to be able to come in so that she could actually have a conversation with him. And he refuses. He's like, I can't take off my sackcloth and ashes. And so her servants are like, okay. And so they go back to Esther and say, he won't take them. He won't change clothes. So you're not seeing him. So she calls Hathach, who is one of the eunuchs that Xerxes had given Esther, and she tells him, hey, go find out what's happening. I need to know why Mordecai is in such great distress. And so in verse 6, it says, so Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for the destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that he might command her to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. So he goes out to the city square, and Mordecai comes, and I love the way this says it. Mordecai tells him all that had happened to him. Not to the Jewish people. This is what happened to me, Hathach. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Taking this a little very personally, aren't you, Mordecai? And he says, this is all that happened to me. And this is the sum of money that Haman has promised to pay to the king to kill off the Jewish nation. What was it, 32 tons of silver? 320 tons, something like that? Some insane amount. How did Mordecai know that number? We don't know. The writer never explains how Mordecai knows how much Haman was willing to pay to kill off the Jewish nation. But somehow he knew the amount. And he pulls out a copy and he says, this is what I'm upset about. I want you to take this to Esther. I want you to show it to her. I want you to explain what this means to her. I find that interesting. Was Esther able to read? Was she not? Maybe she couldn't read. I don't know. But he says, I want you to explain this to her. Make sure she is clear that this means all the Jewish people are going to die. And then he says, I want you to go tell Esther to go before the king and to plead for her people. Mordecai openly tells Esther's servant that she's a Jew at this point. So now everyone knows. And so it's revealed that she's a Jew. So in verse 10, it's interesting. She says, then Esther spoke with Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law, to put all to death, except the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. So they come and they tell Esther all that had happened. Okay, the Jewish people are going to get annihilated. Mordecai wants to go. I can imagine Hathach telling her, Mordecai wants you to go and plead for your people. Like, hint, hint, your people before the king. He wants you to go and plead for the case because everyone's going to die. So she sends back to Mordecai and says, everyone knows this law. Everyone knows this law. That if someone goes into the inner court to talk to the king and has not been called, they die. Unless the king holds out his golden scepter. Now, this is actually recorded by Herodotus. In the Persian Empire, you were not allowed to go into the king unless he called for you. However, you could write a letter to the king and ask for an audience, and he would call you. Why Esther didn't think of this, we don't know. She could have written down, I need to talk to you. Can you go give this to the king real quick? And the king would have gotten it. Because the servants can come in and out, just everyone else couldn't. And so you have that situation. We don't know why Esther didn't just write him a note. But she says, maybe she was illiterate. Maybe she couldn't write. But she had servants there. I'm sure she could have told Hathach, hey, I need you to take a message to the king. Tell him we need to talk. That's all you need to know. And so we're not sure on some of this stuff. But she goes and she just tells Mordecai, if I go before the king, I'll die. And so she's worried there. It's almost as if she's more worried about her dying than the Jewish people. She's kind of being like, Mordecai, I feel for you, but if I go now, I'm just going to die now. I'm a royal person. I'm the queen. And so Mordecai responds, because she's kind of implying, this isn't going to affect me. I need to protect myself here. But look what Mordecai says, and this leads up to one of the scriptures that's quoted most out of Esther, of course. And Mordecai, in verse 13, Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? This is an interesting statement by Mordecai. He says, don't think that you're going to escape in the royal palace. And why would he say that? Well, he's kind of started the rumor mill going because he just revealed she's a Jew. And I'm sure there are people in the palace that don't like her. And there's now a law that allows anyone that wants to kill her. King can't protect her. Remember, it's law of the Medes and Persians. It can't be altered. King can't protect her. None of this stuff is going to protect her. She may be royalty, but that day comes around, she could die. It says, don't think that you're going to survive in the king's palace. Because I kind of just told everyone you're a Jew. He says, if you remain completely silent at this time, deliverance will arise from another place. It's almost like the writer of Esther wanted to make sure they did not mention God. And that's one of the things that we go, why? He says, deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Why would her whole father's house perish? Because she was evidently an only child. If she had an older brother or even a younger brother, that's who would have raised her, not Mordecai. She was the only daughter. Her father's house depended on her surviving. He says, you'll die, and it's going to end your entire father's house. And I'm sure at that point, he was trying to appeal not only to her her own self-preservation, but think of the lineage that you're killing off if you don't work here, if you don't help out. And then he says the statement that is used throughout, yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. God places people, his people, into specific positions during specific times so that he can deliver the rest of his people. This is seen throughout the Bible. You see Joseph going to Egypt. Trust me, he didn't want to go to Egypt as a slave. He didn't want to be in Egypt when he was there. Remember what he said when he was in prison? He's like, speak to Pharaoh, let me out so I can go home, not so I can stay here. You want to know why that butler forgot about Joseph? Because Joseph would have went home. And God said, I need you here. This is not, you don't need to be at home. You need to be here. Same thing with Daniel. Daniel didn't want to go into captivity and be a slave in Babylon, but he was taken there, and he was very influential over Nebuchadnezzar. He became the second in command. In fact, Daniel was second in command under the Persians, the Medes and Persians when they came. He was very influential, and I'm sure that he helped preserve the Jewish people throughout his time. He protected them. He worked. And God puts people in specific positions that at first they go, I don't want to be here. Esther was taken from Mordecai. This was not a, hey, I think I want to go try and be queen. This was a, she looks really cool. She looks really nice. She's cute. We're going to take her. And then she spent a year getting prepared to go before the king, but he put her in a position for a reason. And Mordecai says, who knows whether you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this? Mordecai may not be the best character, may not have the best character, I should say, but at least he recognizes that throughout history, God puts people in places of authority for a reason. And he had put Esther into a position of authority for a specific purpose, to preserve the people that were called by God's name. And so he tells her, you need to do this. This is the reason you're in this position. You're not just put in this position so that you can have all this favor and do whatever you want. You could be queen, Doesn't sound like a bad job, right? Verse 15 says, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther told them, go order Mordecai. Gather all the Jews and fast. It's an interesting change of position. Mordecai has been telling her what to do this whole time. She says, okay, you've revealed that I'm a Jew. That was what you told me not to do. So now I have an order for you. You need to gather everyone. You need to gather them together, and you need to fast. Isn't it interesting that most of the time in the Bible it says fast and pray? In the book of Esther, it only mentions fasting. Once again, staying away from God for some reason. Because if you mention prayer, it leads to, well, who are you praying to? And so it doesn't mention prayer. It just, go gather all the Jews, fast for me. Don't eat, don't drink for 3 days, day or night. There are, even today, there are people who fast. And And some of the other religions, they fast, but they only fast during daylight hours. During night, they're allowed to eat. And it's still considered a fast. But that's how they can fast for, 80 days or whatever it is. It's because they're still eating. Just they do it at night. But she says, I want you to fast. I want you to fast night and day. Don't eat, don't drink. She says, and after that third day, I'm going to go before the king, which is completely against the law. And if I perish, if I die, then I guess I'm going to die anyway. I might as well get it over with.